Yes, I'm okay. Thanks. Yeah, well, I have. All right. Thank you very much. That's helpful. Thanks. It's a great pleasure and honor being here. I understand I have to compete with the weather and the view, but that's one thing. I will not do all the official kind of things because I think that's been happening a lot. But thanks for inviting me to do the speech on challenging in civic engagement. And it's a long speech. No, it's 35 minutes, but too many slides. And I have to confess, I'm a university professor, so my slides have too many words. Don't try to read them, just follow the story. That's the first thing. The second thing is that talking about challenges in civic engagement, I think there is one major challenge. And the major challenge is that it's becoming less structured and less structured and less structured all over the time. So I will do three things. I will walk you through and let me see. No, wrong side. Yep, now I found the right button. So we'll talk about three different kind of interrelated topics, all right? What's happening in this civil society, what's happening around volunteering, and what's happening around philanthropy. But the big thing is that they're all, one way or another, are going into the same kind of direction, that one way or another is becoming less central, less government, more local, more citizens. But put in a different way, it's moving from politics with a big P, or capital P I should say, to politics with a small p of people. And that's an interesting movement. I'm not saying it's very helpful always, but it's an interesting movement. So, first topic, civil society. Direct solidarity, communities taking control, social enterprises. Just all of these words that one way or another translate to the idea that it's becoming less government and more citizens that make decisions themselves. First, what we see is a movement, as we say in the Netherlands, from what they call indirect solidarity. So that's solidarity provided by government, based on what we would say involuntary taxes, and a majority decision, but also a right for citizens, moving to a direct solidarity, which is a voluntary donation of time and money with individuals that decide themselves which whom, which what, whatever they want to be solidar with, what they want to support. But it's also a kind of favor if you get it, yes or no. And there are three different kind of driving forces that make this movement. First of all, is the governmental austerity, all right? But also, as one of the previous said, it's also the function of the government that one way or another, for many developments, is too slow. Or as my business students, they simply ignore the idea that government can make any solution at all. I'm not sure it is that way, but that's how they perceive it. The second thing is this whole idea that citizens should take care of themselves. That they should not look at a central kind of government. And the third one is what we see, especially in the Netherlands, and if I'm giving a lot of Dutch examples, please forgive me, but we see that one way or another citizens are not happy with the kind of social services that government provides them. They see it as too much homogeneous and they want to have a diverse kind of society, a diverse kind of service. It's like the idea that you can have your own car, you can have your own house till you're 70 and suddenly you end up with what everybody else has too. And one way or another you seem to lose the right to live your own life. And that's one thing that people one way or another are not happy with anymore. So that's a move from indirect solidarity, where one way or another we have a collective kind of feeling, to this very individualized kind of solidarity, which has one big disadvantage. It's really not efficient in collecting funds. I don't know about Israel, but in the Netherlands, there's no one as efficient in collecting money as the government. That's a slow one, isn't it? Yes. So we think government is inefficient, but in collecting money, it's extremely efficient, right? In providing services, it might be different. And that's one of the challenges, that in direct solidarity, all this fundraising and recruiting volunteers is not efficient, but it's extremely effective. One way or another, we have to think about how can we combine in the future this efficient fundraising and effective services. All right, challenge number 2. Or let's move on. So one thing we see is that the old one, so this is the move from a government perspective to a much more citizen-driven perspective. And I want you to look at the left side where we have 3 kind of basic words. The first one is what they call civic-driven change. The idea, one way or another, that citizens come together and decide what they think is good for them, which is opposing the idea of government-driven change, where one way or another we come together and the majority decides. Second one is called ABCD, which means asset-based community development, in which we start with what communities can do, what people can do. Well, usually the intervention of any government is we tell people what they cannot do, and then we provide this kind of things. So what we see in the Netherlands is that the traditional way is you go to a community and you tell them they're missing their left hand. And you're going to do something to help them with the left hand, replacing it. You don't tell them that they all still have a right hand that can do something. So communities, one way or another, are now moving into, but what can we do? And the third one is about organizing. So one way or another, governments really are not happy always with the diversity of self-organization by citizens. And to be honest, it is also something kind of a confrontation, right? So what we see on the left side is a radical community perspective of civil change, asset-based community development, and civil society, conflicting with a classical government perspective. And somewhere in between, hopefully we have co-production, co-policy, or whatever. But what we see nowadays in the Dutch research is one way or another from the classical government perspective, this move to direct solidarity, to citizens doing it themselves, is something like, we create co-governance space, and in this co-governance space we treat the citizens as if they are 4 years old. The citizens think they're 25-year-old, but they behave like 16 years old. So it's a kind of interesting thing happening there in a clash between central stories and local municipalities, communities doing what they want. Sorry, forget the word municipalities. A very important thing to understand is that in this new civic-driven change, we're not thinking in zip codes. We're not thinking in municipalities, we're thinking in communities. And communities are not run in geographical ways. So that's another kind of small clash between government and this new civic side of driven change, that this whole civic thing thinks in communities and does not follow geographical lines. Third, what's happening in the business community? Well, there the same thing happens, that the political part, the government part, one way or another is taken out of the perspective and replaced by something else. And I see this as the emergence of the social enterprise, where we see that non-profits becoming more commercial, and think about how can business and business systems be a solution. Businesses becoming more social, caring about social issues, doing things themselves, and we have the double bottom lines. And what I find interesting, I had a discussion before, I don't know if you did this one, but in the Netherlands this is quite hot, right? This is an idea of replacing all these plastic bottles with a bottle you can replace all the time, right? Can you reuse? Now, I find this interesting because the people behind this, they moved from political activism to social enterprise. Because one way or another they have no trust in the government making any law to prevent plastic bottles. So they move to this one, and then they still hope there's a little bit like awareness building that people will use less plastic bottles. Now, seen from the perspective of an efficient solution or an effective solution, a law against plastic bottles probably would be way better than this slow kind of political activism by boycotting. You know the difference between a boycott and a boycott? So this is a boycott. And what happens now is that all this political activism, one way or another, seems to be moving into much more like this buyer activism. Or as my students at the business school really don't talk anymore about the political leadership. They don't think about politics with a big capital P. They think about servant leadership, about making companies that change the world. Again, it's this movement from centralized, we do all the same kind of thing, to this very fragmented, but it might also be that we do things which are against each other and as a result don't have a clear kind of collective impact. Now I'm going to use this one. So that's the first part of the story, is really that we're moving away from this centralized kind of thing and maybe reinventing civil society, or reinventing the idea of community, but also finding out the clash between this idea of community, this clash of citizens doing what they think is good, comparing to the majority deciding what is good for everybody, because there's also a kind of risk there. So we also need, that's the last complicated slide of this first part, we also might need new words. So the European Committee is thinking about, are the old words of non-profits, for-profits and government, are they really, let's say, helpful in creating this new kind of organizational things? Are they describing what's going to happen? And I don't know, but at this moment, all kinds of European countries are looking at, let's say, open up the law around the non-profit distribution constraints. So non-profits are called non-profits because they're not allowed to distribute a part of their profit. But if you want to have commercial investors in your social enterprise, but also use governmental money as a subsidy or whatever, you're one way or another caught in this catch-22 that you want to have profits to be shared, but also cannot do it. So they're finding ways of removing this lock on profit sharing. But they're also blocked with the idea, but can you also make it a kind of company that you can sell at the end? What they call the capital lock. The same with cooperatives, and the same with the idea, what do we call activity without pay, which is not highly organized. Okay, highly organized we call volunteering. But what happens if it becomes less and less and less organized? Just to move a little bit ahead in the speech, what happens if it becomes micro-volunteering through the telephone? Which a lot of political activism is happening here. Right? And what does it mean for political activism on Facebook, on Twitter, if your government can follow everything? How dangerous is political activism becoming on Facebook? Where it used to be so safe when you just signed on the street, right? And nobody could read. I mean, my signature nobody can understand, all right? So, challenges and things. First, I think one way or another we need to create policies for this interaction between communities. How are communities going to interact if it's not in a purely democratic way of the majority decides? How does it work? How do we prevent that the biggest voice or the most money wins? How does it work in a society that moves, and we come to that on philanthropy, where we move from one vote, one man, one woman, one vote, to €1, one vote, or $1, one vote, which maybe is even better, where the money of the Gates of this world takes over the voices of many simple people. How can we create overlapping organizational structure? And how can we create incentives for this direct solidarity, like taxes, social welfare rules? How can we do it at schools? Research. Oh, this tension between government and communities. It's just one open area for a lot of research, right? And what are the disadvantages of these new overlapping organizational structures? And then from management perspective or practitioner perspective, how can we create this open boundaries to work with communities? How does it work? And how can organizations be very flexible to open up to this new kind of energy, which I will be introducing later on. So how can we become Barber Papas, if that's the English word? How can we become form shapers or shapers, changes of forms, all right? Volunteering. So what's happening in volunteering? How am I doing time-wise? Oh, good enough. So in volunteering, I think the biggest challenge is that we have to move from the idea that's about volunteering. It is about volunteer or voluntary energy in your society. It's the voluntary energy that we one way or another translate into volunteering in actual behavior that helps. So what we were asked to do a research on what happens if you see volunteering as a natural resource, as comparing it to fish or sheep or grass or things like that, but also maybe to internet access and things like that. What happens? How are you going to see it? And then we see that one way or another that volunteering seems to be decreasing, but to be honest, volunteer energy is not decreasing. If we see what happens in the Netherlands or all around Europe, as soon as a crisis happens, volunteer energy just boof out of the whatever you want to call it, all right? It shows up everywhere. But then, of course, in many cases, it is not translated to volunteering. It is not made useful. So that's the big challenge here. And the challenge is, how can we maintain the old traditional all-time volunteer, the traditional all-commitment, what we compare to oil, all right? That we use and misuse for all kinds of things. And we know that these volunteers, one way or another, can never say no. So we ask them to do more and more and more, till they suddenly are burned out, all right? And then they leave. So Dutch research really shows that the traditional volunteer is going away, or at least going away during work life. The traditional volunteer is really someone becoming who's retired. The work-life volunteer is much more becoming the second one, which we compare to fish, all right? It's an extreme metaphor, I understand, but like in the ocean, we have all these different kinds of fishes. And every fish, one way or another, needs different kind of food, different kind of catching methods, different kind of cooking methods. And we as volunteer organizations need to understand how we're going to treat all these different kinds of fish. And I will come back later on what I mean with hyphenated add-on volunteering. The interesting thing is that this is the new way to recruit, to find volunteer energy, and maybe translate the volunteer energy into real volunteering. And if we talk about the fish, and we want to have more fish, we don't want to count the fish. We want to know how the ocean looks like. Now, if you want to have more volunteers in society, do not count your volunteers. It doesn't help you. Find out how your ocean looks, all right? It's not about the fish, it's about the ocean. The third one is the solar energy. That's the problem now of volunteering in, for example, in the Netherlands, that so many volunteer energy just pops up, poof, boof. Spontaneous eruptions of willingness to volunteer, or spontaneous eruptions of angry people, something like that. And it usually happens when the organization doesn't need it, all right? The sun shines when you're inside. But might be good here, but in the Netherlands, hey, you want to be outside of the sun shines, all right? And it's a flow of energy that one way or another you don't want to spill. You also don't want to tell people we cannot use you. Okay, they're ready to produce volunteer energy, to give it to you. They're ready to become a volunteer, and then one way or another, many organizations are not ready to use it because it doesn't fit their schedule. And from an environmental perspective, that's a waste of resources. Right? Luckily, I mean, the original research was about the treasure of the commons. Is volunteering going to stop because we misuse the resource? Now, luckily, it's a kind of resource that comes back and back and back and back. But that's something. All right, now I promise you the hyphenated volunteering. So in the hyphenated volunteering, what you do is you connect the act of volunteering to something else in the schedule of people. Because, at least in many continental European countries, we don't know anymore where to find volunteer energy. It used to be the church place, where we could recruit new volunteers. But that's one way or another diminishing. All right? And it's becoming different places, like the workplace in corporate volunteering, or high schools and universities in community service or whatever. And it's becoming, I've made two things in red. The picture up there is an organization called Jaag Job. Sorry for the Dutch. But Jaag Job refers to celebrating your birthday. And if you celebrate your birthday in the Netherlands, you're supposed to treat the other kids at school. Next to that, you get yourself presents from your brothers, sisters, and parents. You need a lot of food to give to the other kids at school. And there are about 60,000 kids in the Netherlands who cannot celebrate their birthday at school because they're way too poor to do that. Right? So Jaag Job finds these people and organizes birthday boxes with treats to give at school and presents for your parents to give and all the other things that you need, balloons, etc., for birthdays to celebrate, all right? But having all these volunteers, he decided to go extreme on this hyphenating volunteering. And this year he hopes to make 50,000 boxes. It was 15,000 last year. And I give you two examples of what, next to corporate volunteering, he uses family volunteering. And it's a bit difficult to read, but in the balloon, it says family Meiss, because we celebrated my birthday by making birthday boxes. And then the energy is not from a company, but energy comes from a family. And we know from grandparents, people who are 80, who celebrate their birthday with all the family by making birthday boxes. And he offers the idea, do you want to celebrate your birthday in a good way? You want to have a nice family outing? Come work with us for one day as volunteer and celebrate other people's birthday. The second one in red is single volunteering. I couldn't find an English one, but he organizes one day a year on Valentine's Day, dating with your heart. And then, of course, all the volunteers are single. And he thinks it's a way to recruit volunteer energy, but also a very good way for them to spend Valentine's Day. Because it's dating and you have the story. He has not enough men. That's a problem, all right? So what I try to say is that if you're a clever non-profit organization or a clever volunteering involving organization, you find ways of connecting to all the other things in the agenda. And corporate volunteering is simple for him. But family volunteering, single volunteering, and all the other things, he has to invite every time, or invent every time. But Huip will be very good in that. Let alone because he followed my lectures, but that's something else, all right? Next one. So episodic volunteering, and I understand that's a bit of an issue if this is called volunteering, yes at all or no. In the Netherlands or most countries, we really see it as a kind of volunteering. And it's very important if you want to make use of these new generations, if you want to translate their volunteer energy into volunteering, you need to be way more flexible. Sporadic, one-time events, short time, project-based, flexible, etc., etc. And you need to accept that people do volunteer job hopping. Yes. So we know this hyphen is almost always episodic volunteering. And let me give you one example, which is again quite Dutch. It's called the Do Good Bus. It's the National Association of Auto people that drive cars, all right? And they organize one day a year a volunteering event. And they publish it and they say, on this specific Friday, you can come to this bus stop. There will be a bus. You will enter the bus, and at the end of the day, you've done something volunteering. Now, to be honest, if you read the volunteer management books, this is no way, all right? You don't tell people what they're going to do. You don't tell them with whom they're going to do it. Nothing at all that, according to volunteer management, you should do. But one way or another, people love it. And what I find interesting, so last year they had about 10, 15 buses, which is not that big, but a way of organizing. What I find shocking or very interesting, there are so many individuals entering this bus. Imagine the kind of, you don't know what you're going to do. You don't know with whom. You're not getting paid for it. It's brave, all right? It's volunteering in all its fashions, all right? So that's the big move in volunteering. Make it more flexible, make it more episodic, go. And what does that mean? It means we have to play the volunteerability game, all right? If you look at, this is a terrible word, sorry for that one. It's translating employability into the world of volunteering, right? And employability is the word we use. How can we make certain that people, after they get fired, find themselves a new job? How can we make them as a society employable for a long time? In this case, the question was, how can we make them volunteerable? It's a terrible word, sorry for that, all right? It's just ugly, but it works, we hope. So what we see is that this volunteerability is based on 3 building blocks as a society you could try to influence. The willingness of people to do something for someone else, which generally spoken is very high, but not always for the cause you want them to do something for. Secondly, the capability. Can they do what you ask them, or are they willing to offer their capability to you? And that's not always, I mean, these are volunteers. So the story goes, we have this accountant who comes to a small organization in Rotterdam that need a treasurer, but he wants to visit old people, which the organization does. At the end, he doesn't do anything at all because he doesn't want to be a treasure in his free time. He wants to help people as a volunteer. So the capability is the volunteer to decide. The same about availability. And availability is where the tension is going to happen. That people during the work time are less available during the times that we want them. But we have solutions for that, like this and the episodic volunteering. Then, of course, we can connect it to what we do ourselves. So we create something around availability, a diverse set. We create kind of assets people will have to bring, and then we create assignments. And if we do that correctly, we have a AAA. That used to be a very good thing, all right? I tried to get banks to finance it, but... Second different thing. So we have new sources. This is the story about the hyphen volunteer again, all right? In the upper part, we have the traditional way of finding volunteers, where you would find volunteers either internally in your own organization. If you're a sport association or a self-help group, you know who to ask. Or you would go to the village if you need people to help others, all right, in the service delivery. That's the internal placement or guidance. But what we see now, the new kinds, and that's a challenge, the new kind of volunteer energy sources, so where we find volunteer energy, are organizations that recruit volunteers themselves, volunteer energy, I should say, sorry, but then the volunteering is made somewhere else. Corporate volunteering is a two-step process, where the first step happens in the corporate, in the company, where they create volunteer energy, and it's made into volunteering by a traditional non-profit. But that divides the process of volunteer management in two essential different managers. And to be honest, researchers, please look at that. We have no idea what happens between those two managers. So that's this picture. We seem to have a secondary model in which people, organizations like schools or companies, place the people that they, one way or another, are a member of their own organization somewhere else. And then we have these vague kind of things like single volunteers, or family volunteering, or do-in-one-day kind of volunteering, where we have no idea where the people come from and where they're going to volunteer. Okay? It's much more like a vague concept, you should do something. And we call it the intermediary model. We hope to get published on that. Oh, wow. And then, if we do it correctly, we'll move from an old paradigm as community, as part, to a new paradigm. And the old paradigm is really what we would say is traditional volunteer management, organizational centered, focused on currently the volunteer resource use is very instrumental, and we think about the fit between the volunteer and our organization, to a much more community-centered approach on volunteer energy, where the idea is that we should all maintain and work on keeping volunteer energy alive. And that's not something that we can easily outsource as civil society to the government. In the Netherlands, in 2001 till 2012, the idea was one way or another by volunteer using organizations or involving organizations, that's the task of the government to make certain that there will be volunteers. That's a bit weird, all right? Because the main resource you use yourself is your task to maintain too. So it means that in your thinking about how to use volunteer energy, how to make it into volunteering, you have to think about what happens next time. How can we maintain volunteerability? Because our hypothesis is that if people have a bad experience in a workplace, they might resign if economy is good. But then they start finding a new paid job ASAP. But if you have a bad experience in a volunteering kind of environment, are you going to immediately find yourself a new volunteer kind of thing, yes or no? We think at the end they will come again, but the lag time might be longer, all right? So again, you saw this one, the volunteerability, 3 things. And then we asked the question, how can we influence that? So willingness is based on social norms, attitudes, values, psychological motives, capabilities, skills, knowledge, ability, but also how do we perceive ourselves and what we're willing to give. And availability, to be honest, is really in the mind of the people if they're available, yes or no. In the Netherlands, 50% of the people volunteer, and about 4 hours a week. I think it's going down a little bit in the hours. It's going up in the percentage. I have numbers if you want, but it's just... that's what the official Bureau of Statistics says, all right? So, and we do find the 4 hours means it's not about your availability, all right? So if you talk to non-volunteers, 5 minutes. Oh, wow. All right. Well, in that case, so we did the research how to improve this volunteerability. And to be honest, we found it's in the mind of the people. And what we need to do as a society, you can read this one, it's published together with Debbie Husky-Leventhal. What we need to do as society, one way or another, the non-volunteers have so weird ideas about volunteering. In the Netherlands, we have no idea what kind of papers they've been reading the last years. They think that volunteers are always full-time. So don't have time to earn money. But if it's 4 hours a week, that doesn't really hurt your earning capacity, all right? If that's the average volunteering. Means that a lot of people only volunteer 1 hour a week. So there's something happening. And if you read this table later on, you'll find out it's weird that they still don't understand this one. So what can we do? Support the new forms. Support organizational change. Remove all these barriers and measure volunteerability, the ocean, instead of volunteering. Try to find out what is the willingness of people and how can you improve the willingness. Improve the building blocks. Don't focus on the number. Second, do research on the new forms and improve how to improve volunteerability. How can we create more capability? How can we create more availability? How does availability connect to the other schedules, the other things in your schedule, like dating, like your family, like working? Can we connect it? How does it work? And how does regenerative volunteer management work? Last topic, 3 minutes to go, it's philanthropy, all right? Are you still there? Now, philanthropy I find the most challenging word in this tree, all right? Because one way or another, it is very difficult to grasp, and it's about all these things. So I decided to talk about 2 things. The first one, remember for me, we're talking about a big move from direct solidarity, indirect solidarity, government controlling, to civil society, direct. We're losing a little bit of control as a kind of collective thing. But a lot of things are happening. And the fuel for this is philanthropy, combined as the voluntary donation of time and money. Now the problem of philanthropy is, one way or another, it's a lot done by what we call endowed foundations. And every foundation, let's focus on this one, has the duty to combine what the donor wants to what the beneficiaries want. And continuously play this balance kind of thing. But of course what we see happening, and that's what we call governance, all right? Balancing these 2 voices that one way or another cannot get what they want. The donor wants the beneficiaries just to do what he or she wants. But hey, they're humans too. They have a voice. The others want to have the proverbial golden tap in their house, which the donors are not willing to fund. So we have a governance challenge. And one of my PhDs defines it like this. We have to ask ourselves the question, can the donors give feedback? Can the donor not give feedback? If the donor is already dead for 400 years, the donor cannot tell you if you're doing a good job, yes or no, right? But if the donor is just one donor, like a company, or like a Gates or whatever, he can exactly tell you what to do. Can the beneficiaries give feedback, yes or no? And the funny thing is that what we call free spirits are also the ones that find it very easy for themselves, but to be honest, have the biggest challenge for philanthropy or for governance, because they can do whatever they want themselves, but do they do something that's good for the world? Now, it's in their mind, and it might not be good for the world. So there's a challenge around that one. And I see that challenge becoming more pregnant, more important, because we're talking all this time about impact and impact measurement. Now the impact, the first level of impact measurement is on the level of the intervention. does something that we do help. But for that intervention level, it really doesn't matter where the money comes from. It doesn't matter if the money comes from government or from philanthropy. So on that level, the impact measurement and the impact idea of philanthropy and government or business or whatever kind of thing is the same. On the level of society, the impact problem of philanthropy arises. Because there we have the problem that on the level of a society, of the community, of going together, it might be that if you have two philanthropists funding two opposing causes, there is no movement at all. Both reach impact, but together there's no impact. So one way or another we have to solve this dilemma of the opposing funding streams, projects. But then the third one, the added value, the impact of philanthropy as a concept in the three sectors, business, government, and civil society, is that they can do stupid things. They're allowed to do their own funny, small, stupid thing, which they find the most important thing for the world, and the rest of the world thinks you're crazy. But they're allowed to do it on a fundamental, theoretical level. And that's a challenge. And I see I have to stop. That's good, because what do? Create space for the stupid philanthropist, or remain space, or have space open. I'm very afraid that after measuring impact, we're going to decide what is good and what is bad impact. Then we go, like in China, forbid bad impact. All right? Research, how to give voice, what's good governance, and organizational management. All right? So, conclusion. Yes, I think voluntary action, civil society, citizens, it's all on the rise. It's the rise of direct solidarity. It's the rise of voluntary energy, also with the new technologies. You can now tag pictures, paintings, while you're waiting for public transport. We call it micro-volunteering. But also a growing clash between the central policy and local action. So, if you're interested in numbers. Thanks.